Before beginning to read The Brothers Karamazov, I wanted to pause for a second to think about the structure of it as a novel, and the relation of that structure to its initial composition and then publication. Because as 21st century readers, when we pick up a classic like this, we're getting it from a family friend, or we're finding a copy on the shelf of the public library, or we're purchasing one online. And regardless of the method, what we end up with in our hands is a full, finished, complete novel. And this affects what we think of as the basic compositional unit. We tend to think that this is just how people write. They write novels, whole novels, and we should think of it on that level. Now, there's nothing wrong with thinking of The Brothers Karamazov as a coherent whole novel. Dostoevsky clearly intends it to be that. And we have plenty of evidence that he has a plan in mind from the beginning of his composition. And in fact, if you take the author's note seriously, it seems like this is actually intended to be part of a larger plan, and that several novels are planned that involve this set of characters, and that The Brothers Karamazov is actually a preparatory novel that's meant to provide background and context for a second novel that focuses more closely on Alyosha. It's hard to decide how seriously to take that promise of a second novel, and that's a matter of some debate. But in any case, Dostoevsky's death would interrupt any efforts to fulfill the promise. We can still read, though, that intention as revealing a broader plan, right? And Dostoevsky clearly has something in mind for the whole of Brothers Karamazov when he starts writing it. And that planning is reflected in the structure of the novel. Like if you open to the table of contents, you'll see that this is very intricately and symmetrically organized. There are 4 parts to this novel and an epilogue tacked on at the end. And the 4 parts are actually subdivided into books. 12 books divided equally, distributed equally across the 4 parts. So 3 books per part. 4 parts plus an epilogue makes up the whole novel. The fact that the structure is so symmetrical and organized and also involves this highly symbolic set of numbers, 3, 4, and 12, which all have potential Christian resonance, that all suggests that Dostoevsky knows what he's doing from the start. This is not a haphazard arrangement. It's not slapdash. And yet, even though it makes sense to think of this novel as a coherent whole, the whole novel is not how the first audience would have received this book. The Brothers Karamazov, much like other 19th century novels, was published serially. And this took different forms depending on what country you were in Europe, and also some concrete material conditions that you were facing. Like in England, Dickens famously publishes both in weekly installments, which are 5 to 10 pages long, but then he also publishes some novels in monthly installments that are 32 pages long. And then there are some novelists who actually publish in bi-monthly installments, like once every 2 months. The standard method of publication at Dostoevsky's time is to publish your novels in parts in what they called thick journals. And these thick journals are something like interdisciplinary intellectual reviews that contain fiction and poetry, but also include historical writing, anthropological or sociological writing, political writing, scientific articles, and sometimes reviews of the very fiction and poetry that were being published in the pages of the journal. So it's a hodgepodge, and these journals publish on a monthly basis. And so when Dostoevsky is looking for a publisher for his novel, what he's looking for is an ongoing contract that involves publishing installments over a long period. So Dostoevsky is publishing The Brothers Karamazov in a thick journal called Ruski Vestnik, which is usually translated either the Russian Herald or the Russian Messenger. And he is intending to publish it within a year when he begins. He starts publishing it in January 1879. But he extends longer than a year, in part because he falls behind on some of his publication targets, but also because he's distracted by some of his other writing. And so he doesn't actually complete the novel until November of 1880. And over that period, it comes out in 16 installments. These installments are different in length, and there's also some difference in frequency over the 2-year period. There are some gaps of months when he's not releasing anything at all. The The longest of the installments is the first, which includes the author's note in the 2 first books. After that, the longest installment is a single book, and most of the installments consist of 1 book. And then there are a few that actually split a book in 2. Now, what does this have to do with how you should read the Brothers Karamazov? Well, you should consider, firstly, what the impact of this kind of serialization would be. So one of the things that it does to your reading is that it makes it more communal, because, of course, you are having to interrupt your reading, and then you have the chance to discuss it with your friends who are also reading these installments on the same schedule as you are, and then anticipate what's going to happen in the next. You also have the additional impact of whatever's being published alongside this novel or its installments in the same journal. And these journals tended to have an ideological bent. Now, authors didn't necessarily agree with every aspect of a journal's political vision, but they had to have some basic agreement in order to allow their work to be published in these journals. And the editor of the Russian Messenger or Russian Herald is a man named Katkov, who is a Russian nationalist by the time that we're talking about the Brothers Karamazov. And a lot of the content of Ruski Vestnik is leaning towards the conservative side. The last thing you might need to consider is what the impact of these particular installments would be on your reading, and how you might be forced to try to find unity within what's been published. In fact, Dostoevsky claimed that every installment that he published was meant to have a finished character. And he elaborated by explaining that this meant that it would include something whole and finished, no matter how large or small the fragment was. And you can often see this happening on a thematic level, where Dostoevsky's books, for example, are often titled with themes, sometimes titled with the name of a character, but more commonly a type or a theme or an idea that's encouraging you to link everything that's taking place in that section to that central idea, and think of it as all elaborating on a particular set of concerns or thematics rather than following a plot line exactly. In any case, as I'm reading, I'm going to try to replicate as much as I can the installment breaks that come up in this original publication run of the Brothers Karamazov. And I'll encourage you, if you want to do the same, so that we can think about what that experience would have been like to have to pause between these published installments and wonder what was going to happen or where this was heading, to reflect back on what had happened before. And as much as possible, I think if you can do that, it will enrich your reading.